This is the BBC.
This podcast is supported by advertising outside the UK.
BBC Sounds. Music, radio, podcasts.
Hello, I'm Rithala Shah. Thank you for downloading the World Tonight podcast on Tuesday the 12th of November. On the programme, unemployment remains at historic lows. But does this translate into a contented electorate? And how do the political parties turn the statistics into policy? We'll debate that. Also, Lord Bramall, who is the commander of the UK's armed forces and oversaw the Falklands campaign, has died. We look back on his career. The Trump impeachment inquiry hearings go public tomorrow. We'll discuss how the Republicans will defend their president. And we discuss the prospects for Spain's new left-wing coalition government. You're listening to The World Tonight with Rithala Shah. About 500 homes have been flooded in Doncaster and there's water where there should be fields. More than 1,000 properties have been evacuated in areas hit by the floods. Earlier today, the Prime Minister chaired a meeting of the government's emergency committee, COBRA, to discuss the flooding in northern England. Afterwards, he expressed his sympathy for those who'd been affected.
Clearly, it's an absolute tragedy for people who've seen such damage to their homes and indeed to their livestock. We're coordinating a national defence and programme of flood defences. There's been 2.6 billion of national investment, and the Environment Agency is there to ensure that that cash is spent on the right defences, the right earthworks, the right earth banks, and everything else that we're going to need.
And tonight, the government announced further support for people and businesses in areas affected by recent flooding. But the Labour leader, Jeremy Corbyn, who visited Doncaster today, used a speech in Blackpool to criticise the government's response.
The Conservative government's response to the floods has been woeful. Just imagine if this had happened in Surrey instead of Yorkshire and the East Midlands. I think that would have been a very, very different story. Funding flood defences and emergency responders is an absolute priority. It's just plain common sense. And that is what a Labour government will deliver. Just plain common sense to help people in an emergency to get through what is the most traumatic and disastrous time of their lives.
Mr Corbyn pledged more than £5 billion in additional funding that will be devoted to flood defences, a similar amount promised by the Liberal Democrat leader Jo Swinson.
This would be a new fund for flood defences, and it is incredibly important that these issues are taken, seriously. What is vital is that the longer term policy changes are made in order to reduce the likelihood of other families going through these heartbreaking experiences in the future.
And she too had visited flooded areas today. Both Jeremy Corbyn and Jo Swinson urged the Prime Minister to declare a national emergency. Carol Foster, who lives near the River Don in the village of Kirk Bramouth in South Yorkshire, says she's been completely cut off for 5 days.
It's just a huge lake all around me. I have enough food, but it's just I don't have any power, so I only have a log-burning stove, which has a flat top. So I've been heating, pans of milk for hot drinks and water to wash in. Pies, I've put them on top and let them warm through. So it's been really back to basics.
Carol Foster. Well, it was inevitable, perhaps, that the floods and the response to them would be drawn into election campaigning. But as every politician knows, it's the economy, stupid, that always matters. And on that front, there were mixed signals from the employment figures today. During the 3 months to September, the number of people being hired in the UK fell at its fastest quarterly rate in 4 years, and the number of vacancies fell too. But crucially, the unemployment rate of just 3.8% is the lowest since the early 1970s. We're almost at what many economists define as full employment. So does so many people in work imply a rosy economic outlook? And how should the political parties interpret the situation in the election? James Mills is a former communications director for Labour's Shadow Chancellor John McDonnell, and the free market economist Catherine McBride is also on the line. Welcome to you both.
Thank you. Hi.
James Mills, on the surface, these figures seem like a pretty good start for any incumbent government that's about to go on the campaign trail.
I think there is cause for concern. I mean, look, it could be a signal that the economy is sort of underperforming as well, because bear in mind that your 0-hour contracts are up in these figures, insecure work and underemployment's up, and real wages are still lower than they were before the crash. I mean, the interesting thing is in recent years, the UK was one of the few major developed countries in which the economy was growing, but real wages were falling, and now it looks like not only growth and both growth and economic growth and wages seem to be slowing. So I mean, I actually think it'd be a bit more of a cause for concern. You've seen some economists say in the last 24 hours that the MPC might even consider interest rate cuts. So I mean, I don't think it's necessarily good news as some people like to make it, and if you look under the detail, you'll see actually some very worrying signals there.
Catherine McBride, well, that was plenty of gloom there. Lower wages, insecure jobs, real wages falling. Perhaps not such a good outlook.
I think that we do have a problem and we are trying to address it. It's impossible to really get wages higher while you have unlimited supplies of labour, which we have had pretty much since the financial crash, because we have been one of the bigger employers in the EU. And with the free movement of labour, there is no restriction on us attracting labour, not just from the eastern part of the EU, but also many of the southern countries that had massive unemployment. We've had a lot of their people have moved here as well.
So you're suggesting that Brexit and limiting free movement could be part of the solution?
It will be hugely helpful, because back in the 70s, I remember it well, there was very strong collective bargaining, and so wages could be forced up by tight union control. And unfortunately, we have completely decimated collective bargaining. And the only people who are able to restrict the numbers of people in their employment area, when you get a profession that forces you to get a license to work and they can keep their wages high. But if it's an unskilled job, or if it's a job that they can't, they don't have a professional qualification necessary, then the wages can just fall to the level, supply and demand just determines the wage level.
James Mills, limit the supply of labour with Brexit, and actually some of these problems could be resolved.
I mean, look, I agree with her regarding actually giving more powers to trade unions, but I think one of the problems you have here is that if there was a demand if there was a real demand here in the economy, you'd see wages actually picking up, but there's not been. That's what's really quite worrying. I mean, I think the way in which you deal with this is that you end 0-hour contracts, repeal the trade union bill, and you could bring in a £10 an hour minimum wage. I also think something like UBS, which Labour are talking about as a way of sort of updating our social security safety net for the 21st century.
What do you mean by UBS? Just explain that.
Universal basic services. So it's about sort of updating for the 21st century what the universal basic offer is for us on universal services regarding free housing. Labour talk about free bus transport for under 25s. It's talking about greater access to free social care and all those things that give people a bit more resilience in the workplace. And I'd probably even go further and look at things like UBI, universal basic income, another way of making workers more resilient in the labour market. But also I think the other thing that we're missing out is big investment in our infrastructure, and to reverse the sort of decline. I mean, the UK has been one of the lowest investment in infrastructure of the OECD countries in the last 10 years. And what you just talked about previously around flooding is a case in point. I mean, one of the things that baffled me about all this as we go on in countries, that you have the Environment Agency demanding, £1 billion a year just to keep, to maintain our flooding defences while, parts of our country are underwater. I mean, that should tell your viewers everything you need to know about the lack of investment in our infrastructure.
Catherine McBride, so in a sense, a bigger state is one way. If what you're really concerned about is wages and workers' rights, a bigger state could underpin some of that. And actually, if there was investment in infrastructure, what do you say?
Well, I'm very keen on investment in infrastructure. I think that's very important for the country as a whole, and that's the sort of thing our taxes should be paying for, because a lot of things are better supplied if it's supplied by the government collectively. But a lot of other things we should be supplying ourselves. And I'm not sure that the universal basic income or universal basic services, which seems to be a little tweak on that, is actually the way forward. But definitely investment in infrastructure. I think all of the political parties are proposing some sort of investment. Obviously, you also announced earlier about the number of jobs that have been lost in the retail sector. And I think that we have to look to the fact that Our economy is changing. It changes all the time. People have less time to shop in physical shops. They are buying things online. And so we have to look for training people towards new employment or finding ways to move employment to the areas where there is more unemployment.
And very briefly, do you think the uncertainty of Brexit may also be part of the reason that businesses are reluctant perhaps to invest, to take on more workers?
I don't think it's helped.
I think that, I don't think businesses invest when they can see that they're going to get a return. It's not really to do with Brexit as such, but it's the uncertainty of whether Brexit is going to happen. So a lot of people have already made investments thinking they were leaving in March, only to discover that we didn't leave in March. So that they don't want to waste money, put it that way.
Catherine McBride, James Mills, thank you both very much. The former head of the armed forces, Lord Bramall, has died at the age of 95. Edwin Noel Westbury Bramall took part in the Normandy landings. He was wounded twice but quickly returned to duty and was awarded the Military Cross for his bravery. Lord Bramall went on to serve in Borneo and then West Germany at the height of the Cold War. Rising through the ranks, he became Chief of the General Staff, the professional head of the army, in 1979. And in 1982, he oversaw the Falklands campaign. Later that year, he became the Chief of the Defence Staff, the most senior officer commanding the UK's armed forces. And in October 1982, just after his appointment, he was asked about the legacy of the Falklands War for the British Armed Forces.
This is, in a sense, a very good moment for the forces, and it's a very pleasant moment for me to be taking up to my new job when the stock of the armed forces, I think, undoubtedly stands very high in the country. They're always preparing for an emergency. They've had an emergency. They've dealt with it brilliantly, and I think anybody who's in them is proud to be in them, and anybody who's not in them may be quite glad to get in them.
He went on to have a 26-year career in the House of Lords. More recently, he was falsely accused of child abuse and was investigated by Operation Midland. Lord Bramall's wife died in 2015 before detectives announced they weren't charging him. Well, Lord Dannatt is also a former head of the British Army, and he joins me now. Good evening.
Hi, good evening.
Lord Dannatt, you knew Lord Bramall. When did you first meet him, and what kind of a man was he?
I met Lord Bramall, first of all, in 1972. He was the Major General, the Divisional Commander of 1st Armoured Division, and I was a humble 2nd Lieutenant Platoon Commander on exercise in Germany. And he came to visit my platoon on manoeuvres, and he jumped into one of the trenches of my platoon and told me he thought I'd sighted the anti-tank gun in the wrong position. And I thought, oh, well, that's interesting. What's an old general know about that kind of thing? Completely overlooking the fact that actually he'd fought his way through the last year of the Second World War, had a military cross and had a huge military experience. I've loved him from that moment on.
It was an illustrious career, a military career, but one which also spanned all kinds of other interests and an intellectual life as well.
Well, that's right. I mean, during his time as Chief of the General Staff and Chief of the Defence Staff, he was always one for challenging conventional thinking, for getting us to think about solving military conflicts in other ways other than just applying military force. He questioned the validity of our nuclear deterrent. He also commended, which I completely agree with, what we can now call soft power, using British diplomacy and development skills in the way of influencing the world. But when he left the army, I mean, in a sense, you could say that's when his career really blossomed. He was Lord Lieutenant of London, he was a Knight of the Garter, he was President of the MCC, fantastic, and such an influential figure within the House of Lords. He was a tremendous figure through all his 95 years.
A champion of the armed forces, increase the defence budget and perhaps improve conditions. Is that true?
Well, yes, indeed. I mean, the time that he was Chief of General Staff and Chief of Defence Staff, we'd gone through a very difficult period. The Falklands War was a seminal moment. The nation suddenly realised that actually the armed forces weren't just something to put on a Christmas card to think how wonderful that was in the First and Second World War. We sent task force 8,000 miles to the South Atlantic and won a really gritty war. And Dwin Bramall, Uncle Dwin, as we've always affectionately known him, was head of the army at the time and really supported the plan to do that. And that transformed the way the nation thought about defence. Maybe if we put a bit more into defence, we could see off the Russians, we could see down the Warsaw Pact, we could see down the Soviet Union. That played through over the next 4, 5 or 6 years. 30 years ago this month, the Berlin Wall came down, the Cold War ended. General Dwin, Field Marshal Dwin, Uncle Dwin had a lot of influence in all that.
But the last years of his life were dominated by those false allegations of child abuse. How much did that affect him?
He was distraught by all that. Anybody who knew and loved him, and I was one of those, knew that those allegations were completely baseless. What was absolutely tragic, and I don't want to talk about this for too long, what was absolutely tragic was that during that period of investigation, baseless investigation, his lovely wife Avril died. The only good thing about it, and it's a very marginal good thing, is that before Field Marshal Dwin died, he knew that the person who had made these absolutely baseless and vexatious and malicious accusations against him had himself been convicted and confined to prison for a very long time. That kind of thing should not happen. We've really got to look at ourselves. We've got to look at our policing, look at our judicial system and say, how can a champion of our nation, someone who's been such a hero of our nation, actually be traduced like that? It shouldn't happen. The police have got to look very closely at themselves, and that's a really important thing to think. But let's focus on what Lord Bramall has done, a tremendous person, tremendous servant of our nation.
Lord Dunnett, thank you very much indeed. Swedish police say they're grappling with a rapid increase in explosions caused by illegal firecrackers, homemade bombs and hand grenades. The country's National Bomb Squad has been called out to deal with almost 100 explosions this year. Most have taken place in suburbs already known for gang violence, but other neighbourhoods are being targeted too. Meanwhile, authorities in Denmark say they're imposing temporary border controls at the border with Sweden. They suspect Swedish gangs of being behind a number of serious attacks in the Danish capital, Copenhagen, this year, despite there being no proof of any connection, as Maddie Savage now reports from Stockholm.
This is the number 3 bus route through Södermalm, a former working class area that's been gentrified with vegan restaurants and craft breweries. An apartment block here was one of 3 buildings in different parts of the city hit by explosions in a single night last month. That's the sound of the explosion picked up on a mobile phone several streets away.
Yeah, hi, my name is Joel. I just live on the top floor. I could feel the whole house shaking, windows going breaking and the car alarms going off.
How are you feeling?
It's not the first time it happened in Stockholm, but it's of course not so nice when it's so close to you. You feel like that environment gets almost violated.
I'm in the doorway of the affected building now. Plywood on the door, replacing the one that got blown out. You can see one of the steps has really crumbled in the force of the explosion, and there are still a few shards of glass on the pavement as well. Police haven't arrested anyone for the attack and won't comment on their ongoing investigation. But after the National Bomb Squad was called out to 30 explosions during just 2 months, they held a press conference last week to explain the wider problem.
My name is Linda H. Staff, and I'm head of the intelligence division. We can see that the explosions are being used in criminal conflicts between different local gangs as well as national criminal organizations. Most people shouldn't be worried because they are not going to be affected of this, but I can't say other than that the situation is serious. This is not a good thing in Sweden.
Police have not pointed the blame at asylum seekers who arrived in Sweden at the height of the refugee crisis. They say the majority of gang members grew up here in low-income suburbs, although many have parents who were born abroad. But the wave of explosions is being used to ignite ongoing debates about immigration. But back in Södermalm, many locals, like Marlin Bradshaw, who's on parental leave with her 11-month-old, have very different views.
This is nothing that I consider being a problem with immigration, what happens. The problem goes way beyond that, you know. I think Sweden and Stockholm in particular is, you know, strictly segregated. Social, economic, ethnic, everything. It's horrible.
How do you think this is affecting Sweden's image, Stockholm's image?
Obviously it has a negative impact, of course, but it doesn't have a negative impact on my day-to-day life here. I still feel very safe where I live.
The centre-left government is aware that's not the case for everyone. It recently announced a 34-point plan to try and tackle gang crime, including tougher penalties for keeping explosives and stepping up witness protection to encourage locals to speak out. But many on the right say that's still not enough. Few places in Europe have a history of bombings this frequent during peaceful times, and Sweden, which hasn't had a war for 200 years, is floating in uncharted waters.
Maddie Savage reporting, and you can hear more from her on the Beyond Today podcast on BBC Sounds. A couple of months ago, Pedro Sanchez, the leader of Spain's Socialist Party, said he'd have trouble sleeping if he had ministers from the hard-left Podemos party in his government. But after the country's fourth election in 4 years and the need to build a majority, he's changed his mind. Spain's Socialists have signed an agreement with Podemos. Pedro Sanchez, who's currently the acting Prime Minister, said the deal should last for about 4 years. They'd still need support from other parties, though, to gain a majority. Spanish politics, though, has been polarised by the resurgent Catalan independence movement and a new hard-right opposition to it. The far-right Vox won 52 parliamentary seats in Sunday's election, more than double its previous share. But despite the imprisonment of some of their leadership, the separatists aren't giving up. And today, French riot police forcibly removed Catalan pro-independence protesters who are blocking both sides of a motorway linking Spain and France. Well, Pedro Sanchez told a news conference that the new left-wing coalition would never pander to hatred or division and must concentrate on the threat posed by Vox and the crisis over Catalan independence.
This new government will be a solidly progressive government. It will be progressive above all and before anything else because it will work for the advancement of Spain and for the advancement of all Spaniards. The only things that will not fit in the spirit of the future progressive government will be hatred or confrontation between Spaniards.
Maria Ramirez is the head of strategy at Spain's El Diario newspaper. She explained the background to the formation of this new political partnership.
What basically changed was the high stakes that now they feel, the high pressure after a second general election this year in just 6 months, and actually the fourth general election in 4 years. Still the same leaders, still the same programs. So it's the pressure and the fear of having a third election in a row.
But they still don't have a majority, so who might they work with in order for that government to remain in power?
They have just 155 seats out of the 350 seats that we have in the Spanish parliament. So they will need, in fact, the support of other smaller parties. And they have less seats than in April, so that's going to be trickier. For now, it seems likely that regional parties from the Basque country will support them, and also a left-leaning party, Más País, that actually broke from Podemos just before the election. But still, that probably won't be enough.
Well, what will happen then?
They will need to deal with the most difficult partner, which is the separatist Catalan party, Esquerra Republicana, but still it's not going to be for free. Today, this party already said that they will vote no unless there's some gesture towards political talks around independence of Catalonia. We will see what they need exactly, but that's going to be the trickier part of this agreement.
And that will be tricky also because of the perception. Presumably, the parties of the right will use that as a way in which to criticise any coalition if they're willing to entertain some kind of dialogue with the separatists.
Yeah, definitely. Both the Conservative Party and the more centrist party, Ciudadanos, they already criticizing this possible coalition with the agreement of these parties. But there's going to be a few options left if they don't in some way try to talk to the separatists in Catalonia.
So the Socialists and Podemos call this a progressive coalition to resist the far right. What do they mean by that?
Well, it's of course political propaganda, right? What they mean is that they're going to agree on some principles for our common program, defending basic rights and freedom standards in politics, in parliament, in the relationship with the press that are actually threatened by the far-right populist Vox. That's definitely a worry now for many voters in Spain. The fact that the far-right party suddenly is becoming a real force in parliament. And that will be also a way for Sanchez and Pablo Iglesias to sell this agreement to other parties as well, which also are feeling the pressure of this far-right party. If everything goes according to plan, we will have a new government by Christmas.
Journalist Maria Ramirez. The first public hearings in the Trump impeachment inquiry begin tomorrow. They'll take place in the Democrat-controlled House of Representatives, and they centre on whether the president improperly sought help from Ukraine to boost his chances of re-election in 2020. Mr. Trump denies any wrongdoing, and the House Republicans plan to aggressively defend him. It's being reported that they'll argue that President Trump's apparent efforts to push the Ukrainian president to open investigations into his political rivals were legitimate attempts to root out corruption. But the process is at an early stage and is fraught with difficulty for both sides as 2020, an election year, looms large. Well, we're joined by the Republican strategist Taylor Griffin, a former Treasury advisor to President George W. Bush, and by the US lawyer and author Jim Zirin. Good evening to you both. Taylor Griffin, just explain to us why tomorrow is such an important moment in this process.
Well, tomorrow represents the beginning, really, of the televised portion of this, the public portion of this impeachment conversation. To this date, it's been a lot of reporting that reporters have been doing, digging through transcripts and seeing what people have said behind closed doors. Now we're actually going to see what they said behind closed doors in public on television cameras. And that's an important moment in this age of televised politics. And as important as images are, this really more engages the public in this whole story than perhaps they have been so far.
Jim Zirin, then, what's the legal case that's being made against President Trump here?
Well, the legal case is under our Constitution. There has to be a showing that he committed high crimes and misdemeanors. Now, the Constitution says bribery, among others, or other high crimes and misdemeanors. So the legal case has to be that what he did in his conversation with President Zelensky was an extortionate attempt to obtain something of value, namely political information about Joe Biden in exchange for withholding or granting military aid to the Ukrainians.
And the Republicans plan to defend the president. What will be their main attack lines?
Well, up until now, their defense has been asymmetrical. They've attacked the process. They've complained that these were proceedings behind closed doors. They've said they were Star Chamber proceedings. They've said that the transcripts have been doctored. But they omit to mention that there were Republican congressmen present at the hearings. None of them have said that the transcripts were doctored. And that after the testimony came out, at least the prepared statements of the witnesses, and later the deposition transcripts were released to the public. That's more than you get in a grand jury proceeding. What has gone on, and what is going on before the House of Representatives, is an accusatory proceeding to see if an accusation can be made that the president committed high crimes and misdemeanors.
Taylor Griffin, at the moment, all the president can do is watch this process unfurl, but he's commentating on it. One imagines that he will hit back in his own unique way.
Well, yeah, I think one of the things that's really important to the president at this point, what he's trying to do is to get Republicans to not only defend or oppose the process that the Democrats are conducting the impeachment, as we just heard, but also to effectively say that what he did was fine. And today, Republican staff of the Senate Permanent Select Committee on Intelligence put out a 18-page memo where they outlined the talking points on how to defend Trump on this, and they're really seizing on 4 key points. That the July 25th phone call between President Trump and Ukrainian President Zelensky did not show any conditionality or evidence of pressure. In other words, Trump asked for these investigations into Biden and the various investigations into his various conspiracy theories about the 2016 election, but that he did not ask directly for anything in return. And 2, that Ukrainian President Zelensky and President Trump has both said there was no pressure placed on Zelensky on that call. 3, that the Ukrainian government was not aware of President Trump's hold on U.S. assistance to Ukraine. This is the military assistance during the July 25th call. And 4, that the security assistance hold was lifted on September 11th anyway. And the Ukrainians never did an investigation or announced an investigation as Trump wanted. So Trump could not have been using the threat of withholding military aid to compel them to do this investigation that they didn't do.
So you've outlined, in a sense, the stance of both sides. That's the Republican pushback. But what implications will it have for the Republicans and the Democrats that this process is taking place as they head into the presidential campaign in 2020?
Well, I think that there's a potential increased scrutiny on President Trump going into the election. People are used to the idea that President Trump does sort of shady things, and that is in some sense baked into the cake. The Democrats will certainly press this very hard. President Trump is corrupt. We need a fresh start in the Oval Office, and so vote for our candidate, whoever they are. But I think the big question is really going to be whether other factors like the economy stay stable. Because if the economy stays good, people aren't as likely to dump a president historically.
Jim Zirin, do you agree with that very briefly?
No, I don't, because in our country, like yours, we believe in the rule of law. And if the president has done shady things, as you've heard, and has violated the law, then he shouldn't be the president.
Okay.
So if there is a bill of impeachment that charges him with violating the law, with high crimes and misdemeanors, and there is the crime of extortion, and there is the election law violation.
You think that will have an impact? You think that will have an impact?
That should have an impact. That should have an impact on the discourse in the course of the campaign.
Okay, Jim Zirin, Taylor Griffin, thank you both very much. Well, staying in the United States, Newark in the state of New Jersey is the latest American city after Flint and Michigan to face outrage over high levels of lead in drinking water. The mayor there has announced a £95 million plan to speed up the replacement of all lead service pipes in order to remove the toxic threat, and he's called on the federal government to urgently help other cash-strapped municipalities modernise their water infrastructure. Health experts say there's no safe level of lead in water and that high exposure can impact mental and physical development. The BBC's Neda Tawfik went to Newark to hear residents' concerns.
It's time for dinner, and Alika Spite is making pasta with her 3 young kids. But to boil it, only bottled water will do. She lives in Newark, New Jersey, the latest American city to grapple with a lead water crisis.
I cook with it so that way it'll be a little safer. I don't want anything happen to my kids.
Officials have given her a filter, but she is still fearful, especially since her 3-year-old son, Kion, already has lead poisoning from past exposure to it in their home. The city removed the dangerous toxin, but now her concern is the water from her faucet.
I spend more money on water than buying food for the house.
Newark's problem comes from old lead pipes that remain in place even though they were banned decades ago. Traditionally, adding certain chemicals to the water has prevented the pipes from corroding and kept the water lead-free. But when that anti-corrosion treatment failed at one of the water plants, a third of the city was affected. Officials switched to a new agent, but it will take months to be fully effective. Now, the mayor of the city, Ras Baraka, has announced an expedited plan to overhaul the infrastructure. Heavy construction is underway to rip up roads in search of lead service lines at no cost to homeowners. Longtime residents Charles and Tazwell didn't even realize all these years that they had lead pipes.
All of a sudden, after 25 years we've been here, to find out that we had a problem like this here, and we've been drinking this water all the time. Praise the Lord that we're still here, well, it didn't take us out.
This is a mess right now, but as long as they're taking care of the situation, I have no problem with it. Just get it done as soon as possible.
On this residential street in Newark, lined with older homes, there are crews here from the city pulling out the lead pipes that lead to the homes, and they are replacing them with copper ones. There are 18,000 homes across Newark that have lead piping, and the city wants to, in the next 2 years, replace all of them.
Mayor Baraka says removing the lead service lines will be a permanent fix to the elevated lead levels, which are some of the highest recently recorded by a large water system in the United States. In the meantime, he says filters handed out by the city are working.
We can't rely completely and totally on corrosion control. And I think that's where we have handicapped ourselves nationally throughout this country, and we've done that in Newark.
Still, some members of the community believe officials have been slow to respond to the crisis and warn residents. Yvette Jordan with the Newark Education Workers Caucus is part of a lawsuit against the city launched by the NRDC, a national environmental organization.
I still am unsure about when I am getting lead service line replacement, even though I put in for it over 6 months ago. So it's all of this that really leaves me frustrated.
It's the same movie over and over again. It seems like, unfortunately, we're unable to learn from our mistakes.
Mark Edwards is a professor of civil engineering at Virginia Tech. He helped expose contaminated water in Flint, Michigan, and years ago in Washington, D.C. He says what happened in those communities and now here in Newark, New Jersey, once again shines the spotlight on the safety of the nation's water infrastructure.
The problem is that we've gone beyond the point where this can be attributed to just a few bad apples, and people are starting to question the whole barrel. Residents all around the United States are wondering, how can I trust my water utility? How do I know that I'm not next? And unfortunately, the perception's the reality. Too many Americans, especially in our poorer communities, are spending their precious financial resources on bottled water filters because they don't feel safe anymore.
That's Mark Edwards ending that report from Neda Tawfik in Newark in New Jersey. Don't forget, you can email us with your thoughts. Our address is world.tonight@bbc.co.uk. That is The World Tonight. I'm Rithala Shah. For now, from me and everyone on the programme, good night. Hello, I'm Rithala Shah. Thank you for downloading the World Tonight podcast from the BBC with in-depth reporting, intelligent analysis and major breaking news from a global perspective. You can also find more BBC podcasts at bbc.co.uk/podcasts.